Hello and welcome to the first part of a two-part lecture series looking at America and World War II. Over the course of these next two lectures, we will be looking at American involvement in World War II and what it meant for people living in the United States. Before we get going, just a little caveat here. This is not meant to be a comprehensive, detailed look at America's involvement in World War II. And the emphasis of these lectures is going to be on American domestic policies during World War II, thinking about how average, ordinary Americans experienced World War II. We will touch upon some of the military aspects of the war and some of the military campaigns in both Europe and the Pacific. But the primary focus here is going to be a survey of domestic politics and domestic experiences during World War II. If you want a more detailed account of the military aspects of World War II, there's lots of great books and documentaries on those kinds of things if you're interested. Also, if you want to look at more specifically how World War II impacted events in either Asia or Europe, or more broadly speaking, the Pacific as a whole, there are classes you can take at this institution and others that will cover that. You can take Modern World and Western Civilizations to cover the European impact. You can take courses on East Asia that will allow you to look more fully at the impact in Asia. So this is a really important topic, but since it's so broad, we have to focus on a few things in a survey class. And what we're going to do is focus on how America got into the war and how Americans experienced the war. So let's get started. When you're thinking about World War II is really two different wars that are linked by the alliances and participants of the day. So you have a European theater, as it's described, the war in Europe, and you have the Pacific theater, which is the war in the Pacific, primarily fought in Asia, but in other areas of the Pacific as well. And these are really two different conflicts. These conflicts really have two different origins. So when you're talking about what are the general causes of World War II, well, that depends on where you're talking about. In Europe, there are a specific set of causes that lead to World War II. And in Asia, there's a very specific set of causes that lead to World War II. So war actually begins first in Asia. Technically, World War II begins in Asia in 1937 when the Japanese invade China. And so the war begins first in Asia. Now, by contrast, it really begins in 1939 in Europe with the Nazis' invasion of Poland in 1939, on September 1st, 1939 to be specific. So these are really two separate wars, but what links them are alliances. Imperial Japan, which is the belligerent in the Pacific, made an alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. This alliance was later known as the Axis powers. And because of this alliance, it connected these two theaters of war, that the United States and its allies saw itself as fighting a larger group, more widespread across the globe. But just to be clear here, they're really kind of two separate conflicts that get linked because of alliances. Now, the path towards war was increasingly obvious to international observers in the 1930s. So the international observers were looking at the world in the 1930s. The path towards war was becoming increasingly obvious. Japan had become taken an ultra right-wing, ultra far-right turn under a military government. And as a consequence, there had been this drumbeat call for empire in Japan, to create an empire in Asia. Now, if you look at the map of Asia in the 1930s, most of Asia was partitioned and colonized by European powers. European powers had footholds all throughout China. And then Southeast Asia was all colonized by European powers with the exception of Thailand. And so as Japan is looking at the map, they're deciding that what they want is an empire. And that empire means conquering Asian peoples and Asian countries and Asian kingdoms, but mostly conquering the Europeans who control those kingdoms. And it's incredibly complicated because there are independence movements in all of these places and anti-imperialist, anti-European movements in these places, trying for indigenous peoples and residents of these countries trying to gain their independence. And Japan is trying to sort of like take advantage of that in significant ways to try and bolster its own imperial designs. But regardless, what we're talking about is the desire to create a large empire by Japan. And keep in mind, the United States has long-standing economic interests in Asia. It has promoted the open door policy in Asia. It has a colony in the Philippines in Asia. And the United States sees itself in competition with Japan over Asian markets and Asian resources. And so, as Japan is looking to build an empire, it is going to do so at the expense of not just the people who are already colonized, but the expense of the imperial powers who have claimed hegemony and control over this area. And so the United States is watching with interest as Japan becomes more and more aggressive in Asia. Japan actually looks at the Great Depression, which is not just an American phenomenon, but across the world, and is causing real hardship all throughout Europe, as an opportunity for itself to take advantage of quote unquote Europe's weakness at home to pick off their colonies in Asia. And Japan gets very aggressive beginning in 1931 with respect to China. In 1931, Japan violated international agreements to respect the autonomy of a part of China called Manchuria, and instead it just marched in and conquered it and made it a part of the Japanese Empire and renamed it Manchukuo. And this is sort of seen as the first of a series of aggressive acts with respect to China, culminating in the invasion of China in 1937. By contrast, in Europe, we see the rise of two really important, significant, ultra-right-wing, ultra-conservative movements. One were the Nazis, and the second were the fascists in Italy. Both of these groups are fascists, and fascism is a political movement of the early to mid 20th century that fetishized power and fetishized the past and romanticized the past. Fascism as a political unit is pretty hard to wrap your head around. It's pretty hard to find any kind of ideological consistencies because they really aren't there. What fascism in a sense really does is it idealizes power. It believes that power is the ultimate goal. It is heavily influenced by ideas of social Darwinism and eugenics, in the sense that it believes that most people are not fit for power, and most people are not fit for responsibility, that power should be concentrated in the hands of a handful of elite who have sort of risen to the top through social Darwinistic competition, and that their bloodlines and their inheritance qualities are somehow superior, as proven by their ascendancy in this competition. So ideas of eugenics and social Darwinism play a large role in fascism. And fascism is an ultra-right-wing movement. It's far-right conservatism. Because fascism believes that the modern world is complicated and corrupt. It wants to go back to an idealized past when things were better. If you look at fascism almost always picks a time period in a country or a region's history in which things were quote-unquote better, and it yearned to return to them. So in fascist Italy, it was recalling the glories of ancient Rome, when Italy was the focal point for power in the Western world. In Germany, they didn't really have an idealized past they could point to. There was no past German empire that had been as powerful as, say, ancient Rome. They didn't have any kind of past golden age, quote unquote, to refer to, and so they kind of invented a mishmash of medieval romanticism and invented and made up historical tradition. But regardless, it was yearning for the past. It was saying that in the past we were great and we could be great again in the future if you just put your trust in strong leaders. strong leaders who would lead the way. And fascism was anti-democratic. It believed that democracy just led to people who were not capable or competent of governing. It was anti-socialist because it didn't believe that everyone deserved equal access to resources. It didn't believe in equality. So and fascism was openly imperialistic and militaristic, this idea of creating an empire. So fascism was a political movement that was on the far right. It was ultra-conservative, and it gained a lot of traction in Europe in the early 20th century, particularly during the 1920s when Mussolini comes to power in Italy, and again in the 1930s as a consequence of the economic hardship of the Great Depression. And this is what helped propel the Nazis to power in 1933 in Germany. And so both of these groups, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, were openly imperialistic, and both of them engaged in militarization of their societies, in militarizing their countries, and both of them will make threats upon neighbors or other powers in search of empire. And so any outside observer could have seen that these movements had a high likelihood to generate war. And then in 1936, Hitler begins to use his military to take areas that were outside of German political control. First in the Rhineland, although that area had been part of Germany until agreements were made in 1924 that brokered it away, but they took it. Right, the Rhineland is western part of Germany. And then they began to threaten their neighbors. In 1938, they threatened Austria and ultimately marched into Austria and took it. And in 1938, they also threatened the new country of Czechoslovakia, and the rest of Europe at the Berlin Conference allowed them to do so. And so they ended up marching in and taking over large parts of Czechoslovakia. And so what I'm trying to get you to see is throughout the 1930s, the signs of war were there. The signs of war were there. That you had a very aggressive militaristic Nazi Germany that had, in three specific instances in 1936 and twice in 1938, demonstrated its willingness to bully its neighbors and use its military to invade and take territory that it thought it was entitled to. In Japan, we see the same thing as early as 1931, with them violating international agreements and violating Chinese sovereignty by taking Manchuria. So the signs are there for potential war, but you have to understand the Great Depression is causing real suffering throughout the world, particularly in the industrial countries in Europe. Also, European powers are facing independence movements against their empires. Naturally, colonized peoples in Africa and in Asia are upset about their oppression and exploitation by European powers. And so there are independence movements in all of these empires in which there are groups trying to kick out Europeans in their empires. And so the world is really at a challenging point. There are all sorts of movements. There's real potential for political change in the world in the 1930s as Nazi Germany, as Imperial Japan rise and get aggressive and take territory. And the United States is watching all of this. Roosevelt is watching all of this because the United States, as Roosevelt understands, is not an isolated nation. It has imperial possessions. It has economic interests throughout the world. It has certain governments it would prefer to see thrive and other governments that it considers as a threat. So Roosevelt is watching this, and particularly he's watching the rise of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan with severe concern and trepidation. As those countries rise and become powerful and begin to take land, Roosevelt believed the United States should be active in combating their ideas and their militaries. He wanted to combat fascism in Europe and Asia and wanted to combat the growth of these militaristic empires. He believed it was the right move for moral reasons. Roosevelt was appalled by fascist ideology because fascism is an ideology rooted in hate. It's rooted in national unity at the expense of hatred of others, right? And most famously, Nazi Germany, it was rooted in anti-Semitism, a very, very violent form of anti-Semitism. And that's saying something because anti-Semitism in Europe, and anti-Semitism, remember, is discrimination and prejudice against the Jews. Anti-Semitism had always been violent in Europe, but the Nazis took anti-Semitic violence to new levels in the modern world. And so Roosevelt, for moral reasons, believed that combating fascism and the rise of these three states was the right thing to do because of their ultra-aggressive nationalism and because that their nationalism was predicated on hatred of others or hatred of those who weren't like them. But for strategic reasons, Roosevelt realized that eventually the United States would be compelled to fight these countries for military, political, and economic strategic reasons, and that it would be better for the United States to do that early rather than later. The problem for Roosevelt is that as these powers are growing and as they're taking territory and as their crimes are beginning to be revealed, public opinion does not support intervention. The public doesn't want to be involved in another war in Europe, and they certainly don't want to be involved in a war in Asia. So public opinion does not support intervention. The public wants the focus to be on the Depression. The public wants the focus to be on the New Deal and the New Deal's attempts to deal with the Depression. And the New Deal is having some success at tackling the Depression, but it hasn't solved the Depression. And in fact, the Depression doesn't look to be any closer to getting over in spite of all of Roosevelt's actions with the New Deal, in spite of what the New Deal is doing to benefit individual workers, labor unions, individual communities and regions of the country through public works. The fact of the matter is the world is still mired in depression, and the country would prefer the focus be on the New Deal efforts to solve the Depression. Another complicating factor here is American notions of identity, ideas of nativism, xenophobia, and racism. The fact of the matter is that the initial victims of Imperial Japan and of Nazi Germany are groups that America is prejudiced towards. The initial victims of Imperial Japan are the Chinese and the Koreans. The Chinese and the Koreans. The Koreans actually suffered first because they were already part of the Empire of Japan prior to 1931. They had been part of the Empire of Japan since the Sino-Japanese War of the 1890s, and then officially a colony of Japan since 1910. And so the Koreans are the initial victims, and then the Chinese become secondary victims once the United States once Japan violates agreements it have with groups, including the United States, and takes Manchuria, and then begins to be aggressive, ultimately invading China in 1937. The United States doesn't care. Most Americans don't care about the lives of these people due to racist ideas. We have seen that already. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which was then renewed in 1902 and made permanent shortly thereafter. The United States banned all immigration from Asia between 1921 and 1924. American racist ideas are showing that they don't value those lives in the same way as they do, quote-unquote, white lives, right? Those who are legally, politically, and socially and culturally understood to be quote-unquote white. Similarly, the initial victims of Nazi Germany, of course, are the Jews. And the Jews will be the largest victims of Nazi Germany. There will be others like the Roma who suffer as much, but the Jews are the most famous and the largest victims of the Nazi machine. We all have a basic understanding of the Holocaust, which is ultimately going to cost the lives of 6 million Jews, killed by Nazi hate, killed by Nazi anti-Semitism. And while the Holocaust isn't in full swing yet, the violence and hate targeting the Jews is well known in the 1930s, even before war begins in 1939. Anti-Semitism, though, is rife in the United States. Anti-Semitism is a feature of the United States. It played a factor in immigration restrictions from Eastern Europe. Part of the reason there were a desire for immigration restrictions on people from Eastern Europe was to limit Jewish immigration, because that's where the Jewish populations were largely found. There is large anti-Semitism in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt's administration employed a lot of Jewish people in high-ranking positions. Many of Roosevelt's most entrusted advisors were Jewish, and that led to anti-Semitic attacks on these Jewish government workers and advisors, and also on Roosevelt himself. Many anti-Semites in the United States referred to the New Deal as the quote-unquote Jew deal, thus using anti-Semitism to attack and using long-standing tropes about Jews and power and money to attack the New Deal and what it was trying to achieve. One of the most popular radio voices in America was a Catholic priest named Father Coughlin. And Father Coughlin was a notorious anti-Semite. He spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic hate on radio programs all throughout the 1930s. And he was a prominent voice critiquing the Roosevelt administration and critiquing all sorts of policies in America based on his conservative ideas, but in large part based on his anti-Semitism. And so the public's racial attitudes, its attitudes towards other people, are playing a role in their refusal to support intervention. And so Roosevelt has a problem, a political problem. He believes it's the right decision for moral and strategic reasons for the United States to get involved in the fighting in Asia that begins in 1937 and the fighting in Europe that begins in 1939. But public opinion is against him. And keep in mind, 1940 is a presidential election year. And Roosevelt intends to run for a third term to continue the New Deal and the programs he believes are so vital to making America better and to combating the Great Depression. And Roosevelt cannot engage in something with such strong public sentiment against it without risking his political fortune. And so as war rages in Asia and in Europe, from 1937 on in Asia and 1939 on in Europe, the United States is watching as Nazi Germany begins to take over Europe. They're watching as Japan builds an empire that includes China and begins to stretch into Southeast Asia. And so the United States is watching, but it is not able to militarily intervene. However, and this is a big however, unlike World War I, where the United States declared its neutrality and tried to provide military goods and economic goods to both sides, the United States isn't neutral. They have a preference. The United States is making its opposition to Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan quite clear. They are openly supporting Great Britain. They are openly supporting the nationalist government of China in opposing Germany and Japan, respectively. And the most famous expression of the United States opposition to Germany are what are known as the Lend-Lease Acts that were put in place beginning in 1940. So the Lend-Lease Acts were effectively the providing of military goods to Great Britain as it combated Germany. By 1940, Germany has taken over the European continent. It has invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and it has invaded Poland, and it is controlling Europe. Only Great Britain remains outside, and Germany is conducting an air campaign with the intent of invading Britain. And so every night, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is bombing Britain, and the British Royal Air Force, the RAF, is up in the skies trying to combat this air campaign. Because if Germany can establish air supremacy, then it allows them to more safely invade Britain. So this is a battle that is really about the survival of Great Britain in this conflict. And Britain doesn't have the resources to withstand this. They need assistance. And the United States agrees to provide that assistance through the Lend-Lease Acts. What the Lend-Lease Acts did is the United States agreed to provide government contract to factories to build military goods, especially airplanes, but all kinds of military goods. So the United States would provide the contracts and pay for those things. This then gave business to a whole host of industries, especially like the building of ships and weapons and airplanes and all the industries like aluminum that went in to support that. So it is a major mobilization of the American economy for producing military goods. But of course, the United States isn't actually in the war yet. But the United States agrees to spend the money. They will then loan these military goods or lease them to the British. So they either loan the goods to them or lease them to the British, meaning the British don't have to pay for them. They can just have them. The United States is paying for them with an IOU. You can pay us back later. Now, ultimately, the United States is going to wipe that debt clean after the war, but that's a whole other story. So this is the United States spending money on the war. Now, this caused consternation and protests in the United States. The reason it caused it is because this looked like a mobilization of the economy that could lead to war. And anti-war protesters, isolationists, looked at this and they began to protest. It said, you haven't declared war, but you're paving the way for war. They're not exactly wrong. This was kind of a backdoor way to begin to mobilize the economy for a war that Roosevelt believed ultimately the United States would be compelled to enter into. But the United States wasn't in the war yet. They're just producing goods. But this did cause consternation. It did cause an outcry among certain parts of the public who were committed isolationists and did not want intervention. You also have to understand, there were admirers in the United States of Hitler. There was an America First committee that was prominently anti-war, and many members openly supported Nazi Germany and believed that rather than fighting Nazi Germany, the United States should emulate and model themselves upon Nazi Germany and make alliances with them. And this America First committee had some of the most famous names in America on it. Very specifically, it had Charles Lindbergh on it. And Charles Lindbergh was one of the most famous American celebrities. He had famously made the first solo flight across the Atlantic in the 1920s. There was a very famous case in which his child was kidnapped and ultimately died, and that case riveted the nation. So Lindbergh was this famous, well-known figure in America, and he was a prominent Nazi sympathizer, and he was a prominent advocate for isolation. So to be clear here, there are lots of groups, some who are just committed pacifists, some who are scarred by the trauma of war, some who are fascist right-wing sympathizers. Whatever the case is, there is a part of the population that does not want war, which is the Lend-Lease Acts, is a backdoor path towards war. And so Roosevelt is making a calculated political risk here. But the upside of this is the economic benefit, the money is being injected into the economy. Whether the New Deal would have solved the Great Depression is something that historians and economists continue to debate to this day. It hadn't solved the Depression by 1940. It simply had not. But there are signs that the New Deal made significant progress to combating the Depression, and had the New Deal been given more time, perhaps it could have played a large role, in the definitive role in solving the Great Depression. As it is, scholars debate whether or not it would, because it certainly hadn't by 1940, even though it had significantly improved aspects of the American economy, and without question, Americans and American workers were better off because of the New Deal. But what did solve the Depression was the build-up to World War II. It was the economic engine of World War II that the United States is going to engage in, that we'll talk about a little bit later. And the Lend-Lease Act is an economic boom. It gives government contracts to businesses to produce military goods. That puts workers back in factories. That helps a whole host of industries that are dependent on the factories and the production. And this is the start, the beginning to the end of the Great Depression. So the United States provides these goods. They are not neutral. And Germany, Italy, and Japan clearly are aware of that, hence their alliance as the Axis powers. And they're just looking and anticipating the moment that the United States is going to enter the war. The event that pushes the United States into World War II, of course, is the December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, what Franklin Roosevelt says will be a day that lives in infamy. This is the event that triggers American participation into World War II. What we want to talk about is the path towards the Pearl Harbor attack. In a very brief sense, we want to think about what led to the Pearl Harbor attack. What led to the events that created Pearl Harbor? How did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, and why did they do it, and what events led to that fateful day on December 7th, 1941? So as I mentioned before, Japan became highly nationalistic and imperialistic during the late 19th and early 20th century. Its government took a rightward turn in the 1920s and 1930s. It became a fascist-style government, and that government was controlled by the military. This is not to suggest that the Japanese people themselves necessarily supported everything that the Japanese government was doing, but the military took over with the emperor as the symbolic head, and the Japanese population simply followed where they did, whipped up into a fury of nationalism and imperialism. Now, as we've talked about in a few different places in this class, the United States and Japan have a complicated relationship in the early 20th century. They certainly had cooperative agreements. Most famously, Teddy Roosevelt negotiated a series of agreements with Japan. And they had cooperated in meaningful ways. And their cooperation centered around both of them wanted access to Asian markets, particularly China. But by the time the late 19th, early 20th century rolled around, China had been carved up into spheres of influence by other European powers, and most notably the British, the French, and for a while the Germans. And so you had a situation where Japan and the United States both wanted access to Chinese markets, but they were too late because imperialist powers had already carved up significant portions of them. And so what Japan and the United States did is they worked together to, in their own way, carve out a foothold in Chinese markets. So they were allies in that sense, but they were also rivals. They were both up-and-coming industrial powers. The United States and Japan were both rapidly industrializing, and in doing so, becoming military and geopolitical powers. Now, their relationships went beyond economic rivalry. The complication of the relationship went just beyond simple economic rivalry, because Japan and the United States had a complicated relationship due to racism within the United States. Japan greatly resented American racism directed at people of Asian heritage, specifically of Japanese heritage. We talked about earlier that anti-Japanese laws and anti-Japanese prejudice played a large role in a deterioration of the relationship during the Theodore Roosevelt administration. And Japan was incensed at the immigration acts passed between 1921 and 1924 that banned all immigration from Asia, specifically, and including Japan. And Japan felt targeted by this. So this Immigration Act helped lead to a deterioration of the relationship between Japan and the United States. In fact, it convinced many people in Japan that the reason that the Japanese needed to create their own empire was that white Europeans, and by extension the United States, would never accept the Japanese as their equals, would never accept them as on equal footing, recognizing their economic, scientific achievements, and so on and so forth. And so what the Japanese really needed to do was create their own empire and prove through strength that they were every bit the equal, if not the superior, to these Europeans, by extension the United States. So the immigration acts between 1921 and 1924 actually have international repercussions. These aren't just domestic decisions. And one of the biggest international repercussions was the deterioration of the relationship with Japan. Now, the United States protested in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria, and you can see Manchuria here on the map. It is the northeastern part of China. And the United States again severely protested in 1937 when Japan invades China. Now, one of the ways that the United States demonstrated its protest and opposition is they provided assistance, military assistance, financial assistance to the government of China in order to help them resist Japan. Now, the government of China, the official government of China at the time, was what's known as the nationalist government. And that nationalist government was under the leadership of a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. So they supported the nationalist government. The nationalist government itself was not, it was a corrupt government that was engaged in a civil war with communists prior to the invasion of Japan. So this nationalist government was not necessarily a government beloved by all of China, and it was not a government without its faults and without its sins, if you will. And it was considered oppressive and very, very, very corrupt. And so, but nonetheless, the United States supported that government in trying to combat the Japanese invasion. This further deteriorated the relationship between Japan and the United States. Now, after invading China, what Japan is going to do is begin to extend south and begin to occupy areas of Southeast Asia. And these areas of Southeast Asia are under, primarily with the exception of Thailand, European control, be it French or British. They're under European control. So it's extending south. As they extend south, they inevitably are running into American territory in the Philippines. And so Japan understands that as they extend south, they are increasing the likelihood of a military confrontation with the United States. The likelihood of that confrontation becomes even greater in 1940 when the United States announces a U.S. oil embargo on Japan. So Japan was and is a resource-poor series of islands. They don't have a lot of the natural resources that are necessary for the modern industrial economy. And in particular, they have no natural oil reserves. So Japan was entirely dependent on imported oil. Now, in 1940, the major oil producers are, as you might expect, in the Middle East, but the exploitation of Middle Eastern oil is actually fairly new by 1940. It's fairly new by 1940. And those oil reserves in the Middle East are primarily controlled by the British because the British have either direct colonial control in the Middle East or they have indirect control over governments like Iraq. Britain has kind of indirect control over the government of Iraq because the government of Iraq used to be part of a protectorate that Britain controlled. And Britain has also a lot of informal power over Iran, another area where there are oil production. Now, the other major source of oil in the world at the time is the United States. The United States is one of the world's leading oil producers at this time, through oil wells primarily in places like Oklahoma, but also places like Texas. And so the British are not going to allow oil to be sold to Japan because, of course, they're engaged in a war in which they need the oil, but they're also not going to send the oil to Japan so they can invade parts of their empire. So when the United States puts an oil embargo on Japan and prevents oil being sold to Japan, that cuts Japan off from basically their only sources of oil. If they don't have oil, they can't fuel their economy, and they can't fuel their army, their military, their navy. Right? Their military is dependent on oil. And so this is a highly provocative step for the United States. Now, this creates a problem for Japan. They have two solutions. They have two potential courses of action. Action number one is they simply accept the embargo and try and negotiate terms to get the oil from the United States sent to them again. The second thing is they could look for alternatives to oil, but there aren't that many. However, there is one intriguing potential. There is one intriguing potential spot to acquire oil. There are oil reserves in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, which is in Southeast Asia, which is controlled by the Netherlands, you can see on the map, is described as the Netherlands East Indies. This is modern-day Indonesia. This area does have access to oil. Even today, it is an oil-producing area. And so Japan could acquire oil by simply conquering the Netherlands, or conquering the Netherlands East India. And the Netherlands in 1940 is currently occupied by Nazi Germany. So they're in no position to oppose this. And the Dutch were already facing independence movements in Indonesia anyways. But if Japan is going to conquer Indonesia, it's going to have to go through the Philippines. And the Philippines are an American possession. And if they're going to go through the Philippines and conquer an American possession, then they have to make sure that the United States cannot respond. And that means that they're going to have to attack the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. So this is the confluence of events. This is the calculation that the United States is that Japan is making with respect to the United States that leads up to Pearl Harbor. These are the events. This is the deteriorating relationship that is the bigger picture story for why the December 7th attack happens at Pearl Harbor. So December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. The goal here is to eliminate the Pacific Fleet so that Japan can then conquer the Philippines and consolidate its control over Asia so that by the time the United States has military capability again to respond, it won't be worth American effort because the Japanese will have so consolidated power over Asia. They will have an empire that is so controlled and impenetrable that it wouldn't be worth American effort and sacrifice to defeat it. That's the goal here. And so they attack at Pearl Harbor. Now, the Pearl Harbor attack is a successful attack. It's a surprise attack. The Americans never saw it coming. But it didn't ultimately achieve all of its military ends. Why? Well, first off, it didn't totally destroy the American Pacific Fleet because not all the American Pacific Fleet was docked at Pearl Harbor at the time. And that meant that as successful as it was, it didn't achieve its military aim of knocking out the Pacific Fleet. But the other reason it wasn't as big of a success as Japan would have hoped is because of a miscalculation. Japan assumed that it would take America years to reconstitute its navy and its airplanes that had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. And even though they didn't destroy all of them, they did destroy a lot. But the miscalculation that Japan made is they didn't rightly understand the economic capacity of the United States. That when the United States economy was fully mobilized for war, that it could produce ships in weeks, aircraft carriers in months, planes in days. And what that meant was no matter how much of America's military capacity you wiped out, it could be replaced, depending on the item, in days, weeks, and months. And that was an industrial and economic capacity that no other country in the world had. So even if the Pacific Fleet had been entirely wiped out at Pearl Harbor, and it wasn't, it would have been a miscalculation from a military perspective on Japan's part. But it does succeed in getting America into the war. So shortly after Pearl Harbor, the United States declares war on Japan and then declares war on Germany. And the United States is involved in both theaters of war. Now, like World War I, World War II is total war. Society and the economy must be and are mobilized for the war. And the United States had to recreate its military infrastructure. As we talked about, the United States had decommissioned much of its military after World War I. It's got to build that capacity up. In addition to building up the capacity for ourselves, we need to continue to support our allies, Britain, China, the French resistance, because France itself is conquered, but we're supporting the French resistance, and the Soviet Union. The United States is in alliance with the Soviet Union during World War II, because the Soviet Union was also a victim of Nazi aggression and they had made an alliance with the British. So we are supporting the Soviet Union during the war, and we are agreeing to provide military and material support to them. So the United States was required to undergo a massive mobilization, right, for World War II, and that will bring an end to the Great Depression. But that mobilization has consequences. It requires government control of the economy. And so as you look to the mobilization of the economy for war, you need to think about what that means for the American economy and the government controls that are placed on the economy. And these aren't all of them, but I would like to talk about what I consider to be the six most important. One, the United States places price controls on essential and consumer goods. So the United States understands that with so much material going to the war, with so much material going to the war effort, that inevitably that could lead to inflation. It could lead to the price of goods like food or clothing going up. And the United States basically creates price controls on them. They say, nope, the price cannot go above this. This outraged a lot of businesses who thought that they could make a lot of money off the war. And they thought they could make a lot of money off the war because, of course, the market, the demand for goods would be so high and people are working against it, they have money. So lots of businesses said, well, I can make a lot of money off clothing or food because I can just keep raising the price. And the government said, no, during the war, we are going to have price controls to prevent the price from going up. That was good for consumers and the overall public, but it did inhibit the ability of certain businesses and industries to make wealth. The other thing that happens is there's going to be a prioritization of military goods over consumer/civilian goods. So what's going to happen is that there's going to be a prioritization of building tanks and not cars, of providing weapons and not tools, of making military uniforms and medical supplies and not civilian clothing. And what that means is that the ability of Americans to purchase consumer goods is going to be reduced. There's not going to be as many radios produced because the factories that would produce radio technology are using that same infrastructure to produce technology for the military. The factories that would normally make cars are now making Jeeps and tanks and trucks for the war effort. That means that they're not going to be making many cars for civilian use. So one of the sort of like economic ironies of World War II is it ends the Depression. People have money for the first time. There's really not much they can buy because of the way in which the economy has been mobilized and prioritized as military goods. Like World War I, we see a rationing of food, fuel, clothing, and other items, meaning that the priority is for these things to go to the war, to support the war effort, and they're not as available for civilians. The most famous expression of this were the food like stamp books or coupon books that were known as ration books at the time. You can often, if you go to antique malls, or a lot of times families kept their ration books. So like you might have a grandfather, great-grandfather that kept his, or a great-grandmother or grandmother who kept hers, or someone in the family kept hers. You can see them passed down. But what these ration books are basically books that are issued to every American family. And they entitle you to be able to buy a basic good like milk or flour or sugar or something like clothing or just or like thread or raw fabric, something like that. And these things are issued to you kind of on like a month. They can be issued to you on an annual basis or on a monthly basis, but you get these coupon books. And when you go to buy something, you can't just go and buy a gallon of milk. You have to present your coupon saying that you haven't used your allotment of milk for the week or the month, however it was partitioned and portioned out. And if you don't have that coupon, technically the business owner cannot sell it to you. And so you have to wait until you end up with a coupon in order allowing you to buy it. And so these ration books were how people ended up, they had to have them and hold on to them. And that meant that, one, there was kind of a black market in ration books, people selling off their rations that they didn't need. And then the second thing is theft of ration books could be quite high because, if you stole one, you could acquire something extra. The next thing we want to talk about is government contract to industrial producers. The government provides the contracts. The government is doing all the spending here. They are providing all of the money to fund the war. They're providing all the money. So they're giving contracts to these industrial producers. So they're pumping enormous amounts of money into the economy in levels that had never been seen before. And that's good for these factories and these businesses. It allows them to make an enormous amount of profit, and that demand is being generated by the government. However, in order to receive these contracts, industry was forced to accept government regulation and wages. So during the New Deal, we talked about this in the previous lecture, during the New Deal, the government had come up with a whole series of regulations that businesses had to accept in order to get a government contract through the NRA or the PWA or the WPA or one of the other New Deal programs. Also, the government had said you can't stop the forming of unions in private businesses. Well, what happens is that those gains of workers, the good wages, the good working conditions, the 40-hour work week, overtime for over 40 hours, days off, like weekends off, things that unions have been working for decades, that they got as victories in the New Deal, they became enshrined in the American economy as a whole because of World War II. Because nearly every business in America ended up being forced to accept a government contract. And once they accepted a government contract, they had to accept government regulations and wages. And that was good for workers as a whole. It meant that workers as a whole will benefit from these conditions. These conditions will be the standard conditions after World War II. Standardized wages that, minimum wage that wages can't fall below, benefits, safe working environment, time off, overtime, things that we associate as kind of standard with the workplace environment today. Well, they were all gains that were proposed and administered in the New Deal, but crystallized as a consequence of World War II. Now, in exchange for this, labor unions agreed to suspend strikes, that they would not engage in work stoppages, work shortages, work sabotaging during the war effort. Now, there's also a draft. All eligible adult men will be required to serve. And what this means is the combination of the draft and the mobilization of the economy means that there's an enormous labor deficit, that there is a decrease in the labor population. And that's going to require the government to come up with new programs to assist labor, to provide workers for the economy. One of the most famous is the Bracero program, started in 1942, which was designed to recruit workers in Mexico and then bring them into the American West to work in the agriculture industry because there weren't enough farmers. And this program will be incredibly important, but also will have consequences for Mexican Americans in pretty profound ways that we will explore in future lectures. We also get the recruitment of women into the workforce. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about that, but this is a significant social and economic change for women in America. Now we need to spend the rest of this lecture talking a little bit about one of the most devastating and difficult parts of the World War II experience. One of the things that happens pretty quickly after America's declaration of war, and that is Japanese internment. World War II brings about one of the saddest, most racist events in American history, and that is Japanese internment. The Pearl Harbor attack reignited anti-Asian discrimination and prejudice, as you might guess, especially against the Japanese. It's not as if this racism, this prejudice, this discrimination had ever gone away. It's just that it had become less prominent in American political life because of the ban on immigration from Asia since 1924. But with the growth of the Empire of Japan in the 1930s, there were the resurfacing of anti-Japanese sentiment that was then directed at Japanese American communities, unfairly and unjustly, but directed at them nonetheless. This accelerated into a crescendo after the Pearl Harbor attack. And the criticism of Japanese Americans because of the Pearl Harbor attack, the hate directed at them because of the Pearl Harbor attack, was due to two different sources. One came from the press and one came from government. So, let's talk about the press first. The press in particular began to target Japanese Americans as part of something called the fifth column, quote unquote. And what this meant is that Japanese Americans were sleeper agents for the Empire of Japan. They had been planted in the United States for just the right moment to rise up and attack the Americans from within its borders. That Japanese Americans were not Americans. They were sleeper cell agents planted here for the right moment in order to rise up and sabotage and attack the United States from within its own borders. This is an argument that the newspapers are making, particularly newspapers in the Western United States, particularly newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst. And we've talked about him before. We talked about the way in which he mobilized public opinion for the Spanish-American War, in which he reportedly said, although we don't know if he actually said it, "Boys, you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." Well, once again, he's engaging in propagandistic journalism with no basis in facts. This whole idea that the Japanese are sleeper cell agents of the Empire of Japan is ludicrous, farcical, and completely destroyed by the evidence. It's farcical if you just think about it on a logical, common sense level. Japan, according to this theory, the Empire of Japan has been secretly planting Japanese Americans in the United States as sleeper cells for its ultimate goal to bring down the United States from within. It's logically impossible for that to occur. How could Japan have known that the United States was going to ban all immigrants from Asia, including Japan, between 1921 and 1924? They could not have known that our politics was going to take that turn. And without knowing our politics were going to take that turn, they could never have provided enough immigrants to immigrate to the United States before the cutoff, before 1924. This whole thing is predicated on the idea that Japan took this long calculated plan, knowing that the United States was going to ban immigrants from Japan and put sleeper cell agents in the United States from 1890 until 1924. It's ludicrous. And it ignores the fact that the United States and Japan had a positive working relationship mostly until the 1920s. There really would have been no reason for Japan to consider the United States its enemy and to envision a potential future military conflict between 1890 and 1924, because they did not have an adversarial relationship in that sense. So this notion is farcical. It's farcical. But in addition to being farcical, it is not borne out by the facts on the ground. Not a single piece of evidence was ever produced that there was any agents of the government of Japan among the Japanese American population. None. None. The second part of the group that is targeting discrimination against Japanese Americans is the government itself. Within the American government, there are anti-Japanese factions, anti-Japanese sentiment, and they are arguing that the Japanese Americans represent a danger and a threat to national security, and that something should be done with them. Frank Knox, who is the Secretary of the Navy in the Roosevelt administration, puts forward an argument that there are 20,000 Japanese spies and military agents among the Japanese American population. He puts forward this idea that there are 20,000 spies or military agents of the Empire of Japan among the Japanese American population. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese American population in the United States numbered only about 120,000. Frank Knox is making the argument that 1 out of every 6 Japanese Americans is a spy for the government of Japan. Just think about that. Imagine yourself in a room with, 36 people, 36 random people, and 6 of you happen to be spies or agents of a foreign military? It's absurd. It's ludicrous. And once again, not borne out by the facts. And it's not as if people didn't investigate. The FBI, the military, investigated the claims of media and government officials. They arrested Japanese American leaders. They arrested Japanese American businessmen. They raided neighborhoods. They didn't find a single evidence of it because it didn't exist. What was implicit in what the media coverage was doing and what members of the government were saying was this idea that Japanese Americans could never be American. At the core of what they were saying, it was a racist argument about identity. That in order to be, quote unquote, truly American, you had to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, of Western, Northern European heritage. And if you weren't that, then somehow your Americanness was suspicious. That your Americanness was not real. That you had torn and alternative loyalties. Implicit in this were the nativist, xenophobic, racist ideas that had led to the immigration restrictions in the first place. And I just want you to consider how those ideas bear out when you look at the numbers. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, there are about 120,000 people of Japanese heritage in the United States, 120,000. Of those, 2/3 of the population are what are known as Nisei, and 1/3 of the population are Issei. The Issei generation was the first generation. That's what Issei really means, first generation. So the Issei are the first generation. This is the immigrant generation. These are the ones who had immigrated from Japan originally between the 1890s and 1924, before immigration from Asia, including Japan, was banned. Now, the Issei had been in the United States, at the very least, for almost 2 decades by the time Pearl Harbor happens, because of the ban. And many of them have been in the United States for much longer, for 30, 40 years. It's been a long time since they've been in Japan when they migrated. These people would have liked to have become American citizens, but immigration law, which defined defined naturalization as being reserved for people who are white, prevented them from becoming American citizens. They were legally barred from becoming American citizens, even though most of them would have liked to. But they represent 1/3 of the population. 2/3 of the population, the vast majority, are Nisei. Nisei are the second generation. The Nisei were born in the United States, and under the 14th Amendment, confirmed by the Wong Kim Ark case, they are American citizens. They are American citizens who happen to be of Japanese heritage and ancestry, but they are American citizens nonetheless. They were born in the United States, and this generation has really never been to Japan. You might find a handful of the Nisei who had visited Japan, but most of them had not. These were English speakers, raised in America, in American schools, participating in the American economy. They were Americans. Were they of Japanese heritage? Absolutely. Did many of these families practice aspects of Japanese culture? Absolutely. As does every part of the American community. Every single individual in the American community practices aspect of a culture that has been handed down for decades, sometimes centuries. It's not unique. But because Japanese Americans were considered the other, quote unquote, because they were targeted like many different groups in the United States, specifically in this conversation, groups of Asian heritage, because they were targeted. This meant that their that their Americanness was challenged. So you have the media and government officials fueling anti-Japanese sentiment. And this doesn't need much fuel anyways, given the history of America with respect to people of Asian heritage and ancestry. But it begins to fuel and it begins to build, and public sentiment begins to reach crescendos against the Japanese American population. And in spite of the FBI investigations and military investigations turning up no evidence of a single Japanese spy or military agent among the Japanese American community, the momentum towards removing and incarcerating Japanese Americans is reaching terminal velocity. And in February of 1942, Franklin Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, calling for the removal of all Japanese Americans living on the west coast of the United States. On the west coast, basically they followed the mountains. They started at the border with Canada, and they followed the Cascade Mountains. They took an eastward dip around Yakima in Washington State for political reasons, meaning that the community of Yakima petitioned to have the Japanese American community in their area removed, even though they weren't under the initial line. So the line follows the Cascade Mountains south, and then follows the Sierra Nevadas through California all the way to the border with Mexico. So if you live west of that line, you need to be removed. You are going to be removed. And why would that line? Because the coast was considered strategically important for military and economic reasons. So they must be removed. So how do they define Japanese ancestry? As anyone who has 1/8 of Japanese heritage. 1/8 of Japanese heritage. I'm sure all of you out there listening to this lecture might be wondering, I don't know what I am 1/8. Like 1/8 of my national heritage. And it's true, I'm not sure I do either, even though I know somewhat about where my ancestors immigrated from to reach this country. And some of them immigrated, in the 1920s and 1930s, but I'm not sure I know exactly the total story to do the fractional analysis to determine what I am 1/8. But that's what was required under Executive Order 9066. Now, this removal came with a directive that they had 1 month to gather their things and report to assembly centers. 1 month. 1 month to sell their properties, their homes, their businesses, anything that they couldn't put in a suitcase and carry with them. They were being forced to give up everything. They were being forced to give up everything they had built in this country. And you can imagine what prices they got for their homes and their land, because when they went to sell it, people said, "Well, you're going to pay my price, or else I'll just take it when you're gone. I'm just doing you a favor. I'm buying it now. After you're gone, I'll just take it." And so the Japanese found themselves having to basically give away things they'd spent their entire lives trying to build. Just imagine that. Now, once they went to the assembly centers, they were then relocated to 10 permanent camps. And these permanent camps are found primarily in deserts and isolated environments in the American West, with the exception of 2 that were in the middle of Arkansas. So they spent camps there for the duration of the war, well, at least for most of the war. These camps will be in place until 1944. Now, as I mentioned to you before, the Japanese population was broken into 2 types of citizens. This internment was effectively arresting people and holding them without trial or charge. That is unconstitutional under the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights guarantees you that you be arraigned and charged and have a speedy trial. That you be charged with a crime and that you be given a speedy trial by a jury of your peers for whatever you're charged with. All American citizens are entitled to that. Technically, all people should be entitled to that, but you can misconstrue the Constitution to say that non-citizens are not entitled to that. So you can misuse the Constitution to deny the Issei their legal rights. But there's no way to misconstrue the Constitution to say that the Nisei do not have their rights. The Nisei should have their rights. And the Nisei argue that. There are several court cases, most famously by Gordon Hibayashi and Fred Korematsu, 2 famous Japanese American activists who, working with the Japanese American Citizen League, will take these cases all the way to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court, in an act of supreme cowardice, will say during times of military necessity that they will defer to the executive branch on military policy. And so the Supreme Court basically says, no, we're not going to intervene. And the Nisei were denied their constitutional rights. Now, by 1943, many Nisei were allowed to leave the camps if they were willing to either work in war industries or serve in the military. And 35,000 chose to serve in the military in a regiment called the 442nd. And life in these camps was difficult and monotonous and humiliating. Now, these are called concentration camps, and rightfully so, because they are places where people are interred and imprisoned. But oftentimes, many people in popular culture want to make the comparison with the Holocaust camps, and there is no comparison. The Japanese were imprisoned, they were denied their rights. It was an atrocity and a tragedy. But these were not death camps. These were not camps where people were physically abused. The Japanese were housed, they were clothed, they were provided with schools for their children. They were provided with, all the necessities of life. They were denied their freedom, and that's tragic and wrong in every sense. And they were denied their freedom because of racism and racist prejudice, and because people questioned the very notion of whether Japanese Americans could truly be Americans, and that was racist and racially motivated. And I want to make that abundantly clear. But these camps were not the kinds of camps that you found operated by Imperial Japan for POWs or by the Nazis for Jews for Roma. There is no comparison to them. But it was illegal and racist and humiliating. All right. This concludes our overview of the first part of World War II and the American domestic experience. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about domestic politics and the military phases that the United States participates in the war. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.